Well, good morning, and we're going to jump right into this because we've got a full morning ahead of us. So if you're joining us here this morning, if you've been part of these webinar episodes before, you know what to do. Please take advantage of the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from here today. Give us your name, the organization that you're with, and let us know which you think provides more mental health benefits: blue space, rivers, oceans, lakes, or green space, parks and trails and mountains. We'd love to know your answer to that. We'll be exploring it at Shift here next month. My name is Christian Beckwith. I'm the director of Shift. We are a 501c3 based out of Jackson, Wyoming. We are dedicated to the advancement of nature as a social determinant of health. And with this Health and Nature webinar series, we've been exploring the health and nature movement from the perspectives of our various stakeholder groups. And today marks the last episode of our very first season. So it's super exciting. We've had 18 episodes so far. And as always, I would like to thank our sponsors, National Park Service and All Trails. They really have made this first season possible. We're incredibly grateful to them for their support. This presentation, as all presentations so far is being recorded for later distribution via our Slack channel. You can find that at Shift Nature Health and on our YouTube channel, also on Figshare for our colleagues in the research community. And this final episode is very special. It has two components. So part one is the part we're in right now. This is a panel discussion that's looking at the preliminary findings of a project we've been working on for a number of months now. And it's called the Outdoor Rec and Nature-Based Programming for Vets Study. It is designed to document the current landscape of outdoor rec programming and nature-based therapeutic interventions for military veterans. As well, we are trying to develop a baseline assessment of current practices within the field, and then what we hope to be able to do with it, and this is where we really need some help, so we're inviting you in to be part of the process, is to use it to standardize practices for such programming to benefit both the veterans and the providers alike. So it's a very exciting episode for us here this morning. Joining us to discuss it are Dr. Samra Aitor. She's an associate professor in health management and policy with the University of New Hampshire. Her research interests focus on relationships between policy, environment, and systems change and how they can improve population health. Also joining us, also from New Hampshire, Dr. Jessie Bennett, an assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire in the Department of Recreation Management and Policy. And Jessie has spent most of her career working as a recreation therapist and adaptive sports programs for veterans with disabilities. Thank you, Jessie. Also, straight from Britain, Colonel Sally Cole Hart, retired, a reservist Army officer for 40 years. Colonel Cole Hart's interest in horticultural therapy led to her research of nature-based therapy and the discovery that a nature-based approach could offer tangible benefits to armed forces personnel that require mental health care support. In 2019, she was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to investigate horticultural therapy for armed forces personnel with mental health issues, and her resulting fellowship report, the Defense Garden Schemes, is developing a network of veterans-friendly gardens in the UK. Good morning, or good evening, Sally. And then we also have with us Nick Otis. Nick is a senior research associate at the Naval Health Research Center in San Diego, Kumeyaay Land. He's primarily interested in the impact of geography on health. His current work at the Naval Health Research Center with Dr. Kristen Walter focuses on environmental exercise psychology, surf, hike, and other activity-based therapies for those with major depression and PTSD. So welcome, Nick. We're very excited to have you back. He is, I think, the only person we've had on 2 webinar episodes this year. So excited about that. So this is all part one. And so I'll go through the agenda in just a minute here. Part 2 will take place starting at 10 o'clock Mountain Time, and it's a workshop. And this is where, if you are participating today, we're inviting you in to be part of this process. We're building the workshop component to be interactive. We're pairing you, the participants, with the panelists that we've been working with on this project. And the second part, it's designed to be collaborative and interactive. And we want to invite you into this process as we explore the opportunities and challenges to this concept of standardizing some of the practices in the space for programs, program providers, and the veterans that they serve. So as with this particular workshop is informing a follow-up workshop that is part of the Shift Summit, and this will be Thursday, October 15th, at day 2 of the Shift Summit, that will be focused on the same thing. So we're using this as an iterative part of the process to lead us to the workshop at Shift in October. So when you registered for part 2 of today's episode, you should have received an email from Eventbrite confirming your registration. You should have also received a calendar invite from Marion Davis inviting you to the workshop on Zoom. So this first part goes from 9 until 9:50 Mountain Time. It's our sort of standard webinar / panel discussion. We're then going to take a short break. At this point, you're going to click the Zoom link you received in the calendar invite from Marion. Make sure you use the password. If you didn't receive the calendar invite, you can text Arian using the chat feature here in the webinar episode, and she'll give you the link. So then we're going into these breakout rooms, and we use the World Cafe format. So each of the panelists will have one question related to today's discussion. You'll be put into a room with one of the panelists. You have a 28-minute round of World Cafe to discuss the question for your room. At that point, you'll be bumped out of your room, you'll go out into the ether, and then you'll reemerge in another breakout room, and you'll have a second World Cafe round and a second question. The panelists will guide you through the question, and what we're trying to do as panelists, I'll be part of it as well, is elicit from you your expertise, your insights, your feedback as we try to work collaboratively to better the space. At the end of the second round, at right around 11 o'clock, we'll take a short break. And then from 11:05 to 11:30, we'll do harvest. So the panelists will report out on what they've heard from you. And then we'll talk about how it informs our next steps at Shift in October. Hope that's all clear. So I'm going to very quickly try to go through what has led us up to this point and what we found as part of the study so far. So as a lot of you know, following wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, American troops returned to the US suffering from PTSD and TBI, traumatic brain injury, and unprecedented numbers. And the Department of Veterans Affairs, charged with caring for military veterans, lacked effective interventions to address these conditions. And so studies that were conducted as part of the Green Road Project with Walter Reed Medical Center and the Naval Medical Center's surf and hike therapy, which Nick was part of, indicated that nature-rich programs such as hiking and surfing, hunting and angling provide benefits that complement or exceed those provided by traditional pharmaceutical interventions. As a result, many veterans began taking matters into their own hands, founding nonprofit organizations that incorporated nature-rich activities into programming to benefit their peers. So in 2019, so last year at Shift, we held a workshop on military readiness that examined the therapeutic effects of nature on our wounded and non-wounded active duty service members. And following the workshop with Dr. Bill Marchin, Associate Chief of Mental Health and Chief of Psychiatry at the George E. Whalen Veterans Affairs Medical Center down in Salt Lake, and with Nick's help, we began to look at the development of a pilot study that examined the efficacy of hike therapy as an emotional wellness intervention for veterans, while also trying to identify the gaps in the research necessary for a larger randomized clinical trial on the same intervention strategy for active duty service members. So in this spring, we were joined by Dr. Gary Wynn. He's an assistant professor and assistant chair, Department of Psychiatry with the Uniformed Services University. And with his guidance and help, we evolved the concept into a randomized controlled trial of nature exposure for veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder that's currently awaiting IRB approval to begin. So during the development of this trial, we recognized that there were hundreds of programs like this in the United States, and no catalog existed of those programs, and that cataloging them would help assist with understanding where the space was to develop a baseline assessment of the current practices in the space. And that if we were able to do that, we could share the results among the providers, among the veterans that were being served, and that this in turn would provide value to the veterans, the service providers, the VA, and the Department of Defense. So our team at Shift, we cataloged more than 300 such programs. And with the help of some folks, we then began to go a little bit deeper. And those folks included Nick and Semra and Jesse. We were also joined by Dr. Jasmine Townsend, who is an assistant professor of recreational therapy at Clemson, and Deborah Teiser, PhD, lecturer of recreational therapy at Clemson as well. And with their help, we developed a survey that would allow us to begin to develop that baseline assessment of the practices in the space at the moment. And our assumption was that by documenting it, we'd allow both the researchers and the providers to begin to standardize protocols, share results, and improve the services for the benefit of the veterans community. And we thought that the establishment of protocols would have implications for the service providers within the broader civilian populations who are working within similar fields, such as police, first responders, or intensive care unit healthcare providers. And then we furthermore assumed that in the midst of COVID-19, a standardization of protocols would be of value to providers who deliver the mental health benefits of outdoor recreation to the general public. Whew. Okay, so that's a quick overview of how we've gotten here. And I wanted to go over a few of the survey results and then turn it over to our panelists to help us understand what we've found to date. So we asked a lot of different questions. Among them, we asked where the funding was coming from. And what we found was 92% of the funding, we did get 69 responses out of the 315 programs that we identified. 92% of the funding came from individual donors. 65% came from corporate sponsors, 58% from foundations, 17 from governmental sources, and 26 from the VA. Program participants annually, most of them skewed small. So 28% of the programs were serving between 51 and 100 participants each year. 19% served between 100 and 200. And only 16% served more than 500. In terms of types of programs, 70% were nature and recreation-based programs with therapeutic intent. And so Jasmine helped with the definition on this one. By that, we mean ones that intentionally foster connection with nature through outdoor recreation activities for purposes beyond therapeutic value, such as to give back to veterans, provide social opportunities, encourage conservation, physical activity, entertainment, or general recreation participation. 41% of the programs were nature and recreation-based programs without therapeutic intent. By that, we mean ones that intentionally foster connection with nature through outdoor recreation activities, but do not necessarily have intentional therapeutic program elements. However, therapeutic outcomes may be achieved. And 23% were nature and recreation-based therapy programs that use an individualized systematic process to yield desired health-related outcomes, and services are provided by a qualified provider. So of the sort of conditions that we were seeing addressed, we had PTSD at 79%, depression at 69%, and mental health at 64%. In terms of the activities that were being offered, fishing came in at the highest, that was 59%. Hiking was 50%, and camping was 49%. In terms of the types of veterans served, veterans with disabilities, service-connected, were 86%, combat-exposed veterans were 84%, female veterans, 77%, active duty service members, 68%, veterans with military sexual trauma, 62%. In terms of recruiting, we asked, how does your organization recruit participants for its programming? Word of mouth was 96%, Facebook or other social media, 79%, working directly with the VA, 50%, physician or healthcare provider reference, 47%, and working directly with the Department of Defense, 26%. We also asked what criteria do participants have in order to participate. Participants needed to have physician approval to participate 22% of the time. They needed to provide evidence of combat exposure 12% of the time. Specific disability rating 21% of the time. Participants needed to show documentation regarding service-connected disability 18%, and 19% no participant screening was necessary. Qualifications, certifications, or licensure that the program facilitators were required to have Majority of the programs required certifications for the specific recreational pursuits. For example, if they offered climbing, then their providers had training as American Mountain Guide Association guides, for example. 15 of the 65 programs indicated that no training was required, and 16 had licensed therapists on staff. We asked as well, does your organization assess or evaluate the measurable outcomes of your programming? 68% said yes, 18% said no. And of those that said yes, only 10 used industry standard outcome measurement assessments. We asked what research or research institutions, if any, these programs worked with or collaborated with, and 21 indicated that they collaborated with universities, researchers, or research institutions. And then finally, we asked what peer-reviewed research, if any, has been published about their programming, and 15 responded that they had peer-reviewed publications or peer-reviewed research published. Okay, so that's as quick an assessment and overview as I can do. Thank you very much, Samra, for helping with the graphs on this as well, which we incorporated about 3 minutes before we started today's programming. So I want to turn this over to the experts and ask what we understand from what we've seen to date. So Dr. Aitor, what are your primary takeaways from the survey results?
Sure. So I'm going to mention probably 2 or 3 things that really stood out for me. The first is actually on this slide right here about evaluation and assessment and how it might tie back to the issue of funding, which was the first slide. So in terms of thinking about what is the intended outcome, the intended benefit, which is a lot of this conversation, and thinking about how programs, practitioners decide to measure impact, broadly defined. What does impact mean? And in terms of the different funders, which were heavily skewed for this sample toward private individual donors, corporate, and foundations, what kinds of impact are they looking for? And how does a standardized protocol potentially help to amplify that impact? That would lead us back then to how would we measure and assess that? So that was the first observation. And you can see from this slide that although the majority of participants said that they were doing some kind of evaluation and assessment, my follow-up question would be, what are you doing? Why do those metrics matter to you, to your funders, and how might we move that conversation forward in terms of assessing and measuring impact? The second point that I thought really stood out was in terms of the therapeutic intent. And I think that was the second or third result that was shared. I remember from those statistics that we had 70% of programs saying that they were trying to deliver programmatic programs that had some type of therapeutic intent. And out of those, also 23% said that they actually used an individualized systematic approach that was intended to yield health-related, certain really specific health-related outcomes. And then there were another 41% that said that they were delivering nature-based programming without therapeutic intent. So of that continuum, you know, I'm curious again to think about perhaps specifically the 70% that has an interest in therapeutic intent, and how are you who represent that sector pursuing that? Where do you think the industry needs to go in terms of marrying therapeutic intent in terms of the actual impact, and making sure that the way that the intent is portrayed and built into the certification question, do we have the right providers delivering that programming so that the kinds of health-related outcomes can truly be supported? That would be my third point relating to qualifications and members of the team. So perhaps those are things that we can continue to discuss in breakout.
Yeah, thank you. And we're really looking forward to those breakouts so that we can get input of the participants that are watching here today, a lot of whom have actually filled out those surveys. So thank you for doing that as well. Okay, so Dr. Bennett, over to you. What are some of the strengths that we're seeing emerge in the survey responses in the space? And what do you think some of the opportunities for improvement are?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd like to talk about was really the the questions that we asked, we were really trying, like CB said, is that we are really trying to just get an idea of the lay of the land. We as researchers try to like guess what's happening out there. Until we did this, a lot of us were like, we weren't sure how many programs there were, what people were doing. I think the strength of this now, we have a much better picture of what is potentially going on out there. And that one of the strengths is that 15 programs have research results on them that they have published, which is more than I thought there would be. But it's also an area for improvement, that we got results from 69 different programs and 15 have been doing research and specifically looking at outcomes of their program. So I think that's both a strength and also a room for area where we can improve. The other area was, I think that the idea that we're looking at who are leading these programs. So are there licensed therapists leading these programs? A lot of programs had licensed therapists. And as CB was saying, that like we have not only experts in the activity that they're doing, but also experts in the like therapeutic process as well. Again, it's a strength that we see programs that are doing this. They know that the importance of it, that it's helpful. And then other programs that are like, yes, 70% want to do these therapeutic outcomes. And so how are we going to go about doing that? And then the last thing is that I think it's really interesting that over 90% are getting their participants from word of mouth, right? We have these programs that their whole basis of getting their participants is, okay, so-and-so said it was great. And so people are, and oh, great, yeah, you liked this program, oh, come do it with me, right? Like, that's really cool. That means we're probably doing a lot more than what we're actually capturing with the research that we're currently doing, that people are enjoying the activities, that they're finding value in them, and the fact that 90% go on word of mouth is amazing, over 90%, right? But how do we support and get more than just word of mouth? How do we use social media effectively? How do we start getting referrals from VA systems and doctor's offices and things like that? How do we get that referral system going? And I think that's an opportunity for improvement of how do we do that? And what are those things that doctor's offices, the VA, and that are looking for these types of programs to start doing more of referral system than just word of mouth, because there's way more people out there that are not finding out about our programs because we're mostly going on word of mouth. So those are my main takeaways.
Thank you, Jessie. Okay, and then we want to turn this over to Nick. So Nick's been doing work on this with Dr. Kristen Walter for some time now with the surf and hike therapy trials that have been underway in the Naval Medical Center. And so Nick, I want to ask, why would standards for outdoor recreational programs with therapeutic intent be of value to the space and to the work that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so one big point is that I have to give the disclaimer that I don't speak on behalf of the government or anything. I'm here in my own time, etc. I'm going to hit on probably you'll see some commonalities between Dr. Artur's and Bennett's points that really tie into the answer to this question. So first of all, outcomes research informs best practices or standards for programs, and also it informs outcomes in terms of diagnose disorders and how to best treat those. That's where the work that I've been doing fits. Is most of my work is actually in two of the most common mental health disorders that were listed in our survey as the program's target, which is PTSD and depression. And research in this area is still sparse right now, but it does show that, for example, that the effects of these programs, whether they're one day or they're a full week program of 5 days of programming, that the effects don't last more than a month or 3 months or something like that at these follow-ups. And there's a lot of money and time and resources invested in these programs beyond wanting what's best for the patient and what's best to most appropriately treat certain outcomes, right? So beyond that, even just in terms of speaking of efficient use of dollar and things like that, there's a lot of money put into these programs, and we're potentially seeing that the follow-on effect, might not be lasting. And that's really important because that signals the need. That's something that research shows that signals the need for follow-on care, whether, after the program ends, if it's a week-long program, you tie people into, their local VA or some other type of program or some type of like cross-sectoral solution to deliver kind of the best care. And the other part, which is really important here, and that's the second part. So the first part is about how outcomes research can inform kind of standards, but the second part as to where standards fit is insurance purposes. And, I know this survey dealt, with veterans, and there's the whole VA system, but just speaking broadly, and I know this is something that we've talked about at Shift in the past, is that, insurance needs something standardized for reimbursement, especially if it's for some type of diagnosed disorder like PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder or something like that. And that just happened with acupuncture here in California, where acupuncture is now approved for reimbursement under Medi-Cal or Medicaid. And that happened because there was a standardization and a research component at the back end. But right now, on a statewide level or something, outdoor recreation is not prescribed because it's not reimbursed. And so the fact that acupuncture in this example is now reimbursed is really important because the Medi-Cal, the Medicaid population is the population that has the least access and is a really important population to hit. And so I guess my two takeaway points are the fact that research operates on this back end to outcomes research in particular to inform kind of standards for the best care for certain diagnostic disorders and things like that. And then the second part is that a standardization would be really of value in terms of insurance and reimbursement in that regard.
Thank you. And so this whole idea of standardization of protocols led us, thanks to Dr. Terry Horton, all the way over to Britain. And we found Colonel Cole Hart. And where it got interesting was that Colonel Cole Hart had created something that we've been calling PPP, a people, place, and purpose construct to deliver a manualized approach for horticultural therapy for veterans. And so lo and behold, to actually find a construct already in place was of great interest to us. And that's sort of how we brought Colonel Cole Hart into this conversation and this project. So Colonel Cole Hart, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the people, place, purpose concept, how you've applied it, how it fits within the context of the survey responses, and then the sort of implications that it might have for the establishment of a manualized approach for other nature-based therapies.
Christian, thank you very much. I think there's quite a lot of questions within that question. So I think what I'll just do for everybody who's joined today is just to say that what we've done based on, as Christian said, I've done a master's in social and therapeutic horticulture That led on to a Churchill Fellowship that I came across to the States this time last year for 6 weeks, and I did 2 weeks in Scandinavia because the Danish Army and the University of Copenhagen have worked very closely in this space. And as far as I was concerned, there was best practice because they have done a randomized control trial, and they've taken, I think it was 48 patients that attended a cognitive behavioral therapy program, and then for 10 weeks, once a week, and then a nature-based therapy program once a week. And so they're not really in competition, but they went through a similar length of program. One was in a group therapy outdoors, and one was one-to-one with a psychologist in a hospital. And for the military community, there were a number of lessons that I picked up there that I just knew from my experience as an educator, having taught soldiers promotion exams and various different training over the years. That program actually for this client group, a structured program for this client group, actually I would genuinely say, and we've now delivered 5 or 6 of our 10-week intervention, creates a feeling of safety and security. It may not do that for other client groups that are looking to take part in horticultural therapy, let's say dementia patients or children with special needs. But for military, this community, it doesn't feel over-programmed. So we've looked at a number of programs through my fellowship. I went coast to coast across the States. 10 weeks feels about right. It also works in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And so we have once a week for 3 hours a group therapy, and we very much picking up back on the survey results. We have a trained gardener, but that can cover a range of skills in terms of gardening, but we absolutely always have a trained horticultural therapist. Although I would say from experience, as we go further afield and maybe can't start to run out of horticultural therapists, an occupational therapist with an interest in the function of horticulture, partnered with a gardener would be as effective. It's that clinical approach. It's the fact that each session has a therapeutic aim and each session has therapeutic outcomes. And we use a 4-point scale. We measure, or each session will have a variety of either physical, cognitive, emotional, or social outcomes. So we very much fit into the smaller percentage. I seem to remember it might have been 26 or 18%, but we have worked our way through 18 months of pilot to feel very comfortable that it works for our client group. And we have weeks 1 to 3, a sort of bedding in the group, getting to know each other, weeks 4 to 7, skills development, and then an integral part of our program is in probably about week 6 or 7, they have an individual session outside the garden to talk about how would you like to progress into the community? Is there anything in this program that you would like to take forward? So I think that possibly covers most of your questions. Relating that construct. So we're taking a particular group of people that have had a similar experience, similar training, similar culture, clearly, working with them together in a group. That stays the same in the construct. The purpose is the same. It's horticulture. It varies with the gardens we're in. Some are allotments and community gardens. Others are specialist market, producing market produce for restaurants, particularly in Northern Ireland, for restaurants in Belfast. So they have a common purpose, an occupation, and then each place is special, but it's really the practitioner and the way the practitioner, so is it the process or the practitioner that pulls those 3 things together? I think it's more for a breakout session, but I genuinely think that we can apply that construct to hiking. We can talk about the same community. We can work together on what is that purpose. Is it navigation? Is it teamwork? Is it being more observant and mindful of the world around you? There's a number of themes you would pick up for a hiking intervention. Some are similar, some will be like navigation, specialist to hiking. And then clearly the place, depending on whether it's an urban park or a much bigger park, a national park, the therapist would work, as they do, would work with the tools that they've got.
Yeah, thank you. And this got really exciting. I think the ball ran and bounced past me and I started running after it very quickly because it's so related to what we're trying to do with Nick and Bill. down in Salt Lake, could we take a readily accessible pursuit such as hiking and distill it into a manualized approach that borrowed from the PPP construct? So could we do a cohort size of, let's say, 3, 4, and a guide in place of the gardener, and a therapist to help with the process, and actually use that to create a more of a manualized approach that would lead us down this road of not only providing a more systematic delivery of these programs for the space writ large, but also something that Blue Cross Blue Shield could reimburse for example. So that was going to be the focus of this particular webinar, but we realized we're really getting ahead of ourselves, because what we need to do is hear from you, the folks that are the providers, or that are the vets who have been receiving these sorts of, been on the receiving end of these sorts of these programs. And so I do want to open it up to some questions. And let's see, we've got one from Aaron Leonard. And so Aaron, I spoke with Aaron yesterday. He's with the Sierra Club Military Outdoors. And as with so many folks, this project is of great interest to him as well. And he asks, if Accelerating Veterans Recovery Outdoors Act passes in this congressional session, will this group help to shape conversation around establishing an outdoor behavioral health model within the VA system? And how might that affect this project? And does anybody have any insight on that for Aaron? To be so honest, this project started in June. It's been something that we've been doing, largely in our sort of in the margins of our work. And so we're pretty limited in our bandwidth. I know that all the participants so far have taken this on gratis, and we're doing this in addition to trying to get ready for Shift itself. So this is also where we invite folks in. We want to partner with organizations that are interested in this whole concept of trying to create a manualized approach to the delivery of these sorts of programs. And if that leads us down this the Veterans Recovery Outdoors Act path, I think we would welcome that. But we're not a big operation here, and we welcome the sort of insight and perspective that you all can bring to this conversation. Anybody have any other?
I'll add a little bit to that. I think what I can see happening potentially there as an opportunity really is when a policy like that actually passes and moves to implementation, then the impetus, I think, for the kinds of collaborative partnerships that can produce the kinds of research that Nick alluded to, outcomes focused. I know that within the VA system, usually it requires a partnership with VA medical personnel or PhDs who have a research affiliation through the VA, and often another university partner, in order to get the kind of funding to establish a clinical trial, which would then lead to the kinds of rigorous outcomes that Nick spoke about. So it's a way I think that policy can both drive collaborative research that is necessary to move the ball forward, and also I think just offer another way to motivate the standardized practices that we've been talking about, broadly speaking.
Thank you. And we've got another question. This one's from Jason Alves. After fishing, camping, and hiking, was there another leading approach? And so I've got it pulled up on my screen right now. And the next, the practice that was next most prevalent, I think, was climbing was 34%, canoeing was 35%, kayaking was 35%. We had a lot of equine and horseback riding, and that was 32%. And what was interesting in the survey responses, I looked over them, was the equine therapy had some of the most regimented approaches to the delivery of the therapeutic programs, which was interesting from my perspective. So I want to ask another question of the group. in your experience in the space, what are some of the challenges that you've heard the providers of programs struggling with, and how could the establishment of protocols help them with these challenges? Jesse, what do you got for us on that one?
So, from the perspective, you're asking from the perspective of providers, what are their challenges? At least what I've heard them say.
Yeah.
I think some of the challenges are finding funding that to provide this program. I know a lot of the programs that we have seen do a really nice job of fundraising, right? To survive, you have to be able to fundraise, but other type of funding. Getting participants to show up might be a challenge. They have people sign up, but a lot of times individuals don't show up. And then that's actually one of my questions that I'm in my breakout room that we're going to ask. I want to hear what people's challenges are and what they're seeing as kind of barriers to programming or things like that. But those are like the two main things that I hear them talk about is funding and then getting people to actually show up. Others?
Nick, Semra, Sally?
I guess I have an add-on to that might not answer the question exactly. This isn't a politician thing, but this is just an add-on. And it's that the fact that, as Jesse mentioned, maybe people are signing up and not showing up is a place where having research can inform that a bit. So for example, there's this paradox where exercise is good for mental health and physical health, but maybe someone's mental health or physical health prevents them from exercising. Fatigue, low affect, low motivation, things like that. And so behaviorally, exercise becomes this thing that is good, but maybe for different reasons is out of reach. So people are avoidant with PTSD, for example, or with an anxiety disorder, and so they don't want to. They can't show up for one reason or another. And so to Jesse's point, that last point she made, if we can have some type of research kind of informing that part of things, that might help alleviate that problem.
I'll just add one other thing that I often, my role usually is the person coming in to help evaluate the therapeutic intent part. And the other challenge that's often faced is once you get them in, getting people to stay in and completing the necessary assessments so you can measure the follow-up component that Nick spoke about, which is so important to actually measuring outcomes in a rigorous research-based way. If you're not really getting, the endpoints or the necessary touch points with people, it's hard to measure that appropriately. So I think there's the challenge of recruitment, retention, and the kind of retention that Dr. Sally Hart shared was just amazing for her her approach, where she really was able to maintain a high level of retention. So there are lessons to be learned from prior practices, from research, and it really does become a circle where you can learn from a research approach what is helping to retain participants. That can be part of formative research. And again, we can all help each other learn as we go. So just to underscore some previous points.
And I think to build off that as well is that keeping people interested in research, but then also what questions do we even ask, right? Like that's the reason why I've worked with so many programs, because they reach out and they'd be like, we don't know what we need to be looking at. We don't even know how to go about measuring this. We don't know what we don't know. And that's completely fine. And that's why I think probably a lot of you are sitting in this panel discussion, because you want to do this and you want to find your outcomes and you want to see the positives, and you need help with that. And that's a lot of reasons why people reach out to me, is like, I need help with this aspect of it because I don't have a research background as well. So, yeah.
I think that just as a follow-up from the way we've approached it, and that is linked to one of my findings at the Chicago Botanic Garden and some published research by, I'll come back, I'll remember it and let you have it, but it's about partnering. It's about the garden project doing staying in its swim lane and doing what the garden project does best, and partnering with a mental health charity. So every garden that the Defence Garden Scheme goes into, we are partnering with a mental health provider. So in Chicago, it's Thresholds. They absolutely believe in green care, but they don't want to run the garden. They don't want to own the garden, but they want to be able to offer green care to their clients. And it was one of the most powerful bits of feedback from a US Marine when I was there. And he sort of said, well, it's therapy without labels, and we don't do labels. And I was thinking, why have I got to write 15,000 words on why horticultural therapy is good for the military? Because he's just explained it. But Thresholds owns the client. Thresholds is responsible for the client, and then the garden is delivering, in their case, a variation. And if Terry's in the audience, then there's a university that's doing the evaluation. So it's not the grassroots charity trying to be all things to recruit the people. They are specializing in their swim lane and partnering with the mental health provider who owns the client. And then you work with the processes so that if something comes up in the garden program, you share with their health and wellbeing advisor. And if there's any risk escalation, again, the garden charity isn't the garden program isn't trying to own all of that responsibility, even though there is a trained horticultural therapist there to deal with things on a weekly basis.
Great. We've got another question from Aaron, and this is something that we've been talking about internally as well. Do you think there might be an increase in emotional risk in programs providing wilderness therapy to military veterans without standardized practice?
I was just typing the response to this, and I was saying that it's a good question, and that absolutely, yes. And that's another really important reason why standardization is important.
Yeah, and a trained therapist as well as a trained hiking guide or mountain guide, as part of the program. Yeah.
And so toward that end, I just want to ask what nature-based therapeutic interventions have had the most impact, positive or negative, for you that you've seen in the space? What are some of the risks that Aaron's referring to that you've seen play out in the space? Samra?
Oh, I can mention a few that diverge a little bit from the veterans space. Is that fair game, or do you want to stick primarily just to veterans research? I guess I'll start with veterans, but there's some lessons from similar populations. So with veterans especially, I think, again, it's when you showed the slide of the kinds of targeted conditions, which included PTSD, depression, and then also the different types of veterans served. For example, one of the categories was victims of sexual trauma. Those would require, a really specific therapeutic approach. And I think any one of us would think we wouldn't want to just claim that we can solve such complex problems without having the right training, as Sally Colhard mentioned, again, with having the people who do that well on our team. So making sure that this team that is delivering the intervention, whatever it is, includes the right mix of people to address these very sensitive kinds of issues would be important.
Thank you. Jesse, any comments on that?
That I agree with what everyone else said. Yes. I think, yes, I think because we're all in this world, we all wholeheartedly believe that, right? Like, we need to have these types of research and certified therapists so that we aren't causing harm. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nick, any additional thoughts on that?
Just that, we're talking a lot about, standardization and how important it is. And sometimes perhaps programs can feel like maybe those are putting them into boxes that they don't want to be in. But I guess I would add that standardization and personalization can coexist. And that's a really important point, because, you know, and it's really important to have these standards. It's also really important to have different unique aspects of each program, and that standardization doesn't necessarily mean, you know, this is how it's going to be, and you're going to be pigeonholed into this thing you have to do, and there's no more personalization. They can both exist at the same time.
Yeah, I completely support that, and it's easy, not easy, but it's common for people to assume that they can't, and to say standardization is too formal and this needs to be a space. If people are in mental health recovery, you know, then they shouldn't be standardized. They need to be able to do whatever they want to be able to do. And as I say, our experience is for this community, it creates the programming, and the standardization creates a structure they're very familiar with from their training and from their culture, and that creates a safe space. And coming back to this point about, could it cause emotional harm, and us all agreeing that it could without the right qualified professionals to support them. It's not really just emotional harm. We should be creating a space, I think, and we have helped people on our program who've been allowed to go into that emotional space and feel worse, because in feeling worse in a supportive way, they've come to recognize they need help, that they may have had a more clinical help, that they may have had a stigma about accessing in the past. So we have had, through about 35 individuals, I would say 2 who have scored. We evaluate using our National Health Service general anxiety and depression scores, and some scores have gone down, and we absolutely recognize that that is not a bad outcome. If somebody at the end of a 10-week program feels safe and secure enough to say, I do recognize now I've got PTSD. I do want to access more clinical support, whereas prior to that he was rejecting, or he or she was rejecting that idea. That's a good outcome. And so being, you know, that opening up that emotional space, but it is critical that there are professionals there that can support them at the time and help them access and be connected, not signposted, connected to the next and appropriate service.
Wonderful. Okay, so now we're approaching the end of part 1. So Arian, as she just reminded everybody in the chat feature, you can join the workshop. So we're going to click out of this, join the workshop portion of the event. You'll get click on the Zoom link that was included in the calendar invite that was sent out last night. She says she also just sent an email to registered attendees with the link and password. And so when we come back, take a short break, be back at the top of the hour, we'll dive into the World Cafe sessions. We'll do 2 of them. Each one of the panelists will have our own question, and we're actively inviting you into this process. Help us answer these questions, and then we'll report out on them at the conclusion of this workshop, and the results will inform the proceedings for Shift in October. So bye for just a minute. Go do what you got to do, and we'll see you back here at the top of the hour. Thank you.
Erin really shared, I think, a really wonderful thought point with us, which was the idea of knowing how to measure impact involved knowing that you have given people the authentic choice to say yes or no to something. So in this context, it would be the authentic choice for veterans to choose whether they wanted a nature-based experience. And where that was coming from was he didn't feel, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Erin, is that currently, because we're not messaging correctly or really providing the right opportunities to reach people, many people do not even have that choice to say yes or no to this experience. And then the other ways that people spoke about impact was relating to recruitment and retention. So the words we talked about were showing up and sticking with it. Can you get participants to come to your program and then instill enough trust so that they stick with it and eventually move into roles with leadership and potential to really move toward what we would think of as more of a collective efficacy kind of approach. So embedded in this is some ways of thinking about impact in terms of building self-efficacy, the skill and the will to increase personal agency, but eventually moving toward collective efficacy, where as a group, as a cohort, we're instilling empowerment to lift all boats. And that would include the team members, I think, too, the practitioners. And then the last one, which folks mentioned, was replication. So we can think about impact as the ability to have something that we measure as being beneficial, and we are able to replicate that on a wider scale, the idea of scaling up. So those were some of the main things, and I'd like to ask Jessie if she noted anything else that I might have missed, just for the impact part.
For the impact part, no, I think that covered a lot of what we had talked about. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe then, Jessie, we could segue to your question about challenges and the benefit of a manualized or standardized protocol.
Yep. Yeah. So that's, yeah, my question about challenges, and then if a standardized protocol could impact that. And I think one thing that connected with what Semra was saying was that we really need valid and reliable tools and know how to get them and to implement them within our programs. That was brought up. And then funding is a big challenge barrier that programs are finding, that either they get funding or finding funding is difficult. And then when they do get funding, that sustained funding on what happens afterwards, right? And so how a manualized approach could potentially impact our ability to find funding and keep funding. And then there was other challenges like training of understanding the types of leadership that we should be running the programs, ideas around risk management. Obviously, COVID-19 has impacted programming immensely, and how is that impacting programming, and what are we going to do because of it, those kind of things. So I think that those were like the main things that we got out of the challenges that were there and how manualized programming could help impact them. We also do have like the opposite side of that, of making sure that this manualized programming or protocols that, yes, they're great and good and give us a direction to go, but at the same time, it may take away creativity or might not be something they could actually implement in their area. Just different ideas of like that. We don't want to be so focused on only a manualized approach that that's the only way they could get funding, that there are programs out there that want to tweak it or do it a little bit differently. So just that kind of back and forth, which I think Nick brought up a really good point of understanding that personalization piece, that we're not saying this is the only way you can do it. But this is how we know that it's going to implement and get the outcomes that we want to have. And then there's that personalization piece that you can bring in. So.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate that a theme we're finding that's recurring is this need to think about standardization without losing flexibility and innovation and the personalization, which don't have to be antithetical. And so I think that's where we can continue to talk.
Yeah.
Excellent. As I try to take some notes. Okay, sorry. Okay, and so next I've got Nick on my screen. Nick, what was your question?
Ellie and I were together and we had two questions. Maybe I'll take the first one and she can take the second one. The first one was, what elements of nature-based interventions have you seen work that you feel should be adopted by other programs? And the highlighted ones that we talked about, the first one that immediately came up and was reiterated across the sessions is reciprocity, in terms of perhaps like healing nature and also receiving healing from nature is how it was worded. And so and other folks talked about how maybe having your dose of nature, like taking a pill, can be seen as like extractive, and how kind of having some type of relational value with nature is something that has worked and is a good component of things. So reciprocity. The second one that immediately came up, especially I think for the military veteran population, is purpose. And that came up multiple times in a lot of different ways. But essentially, that purpose and the ownership was really big. The other thing was sharing the experience, so some type of element of social connection or building of a community, probably for two reasons we talked about. One being that social interaction is important for health, and also, well, I guess there's three reasons. So it's important for health. The military veteran population, kind of when you transition to being a veteran, you were in this cohort model, so to speak, and then you fall off of that, and now you don't have that. So having that group is important. And then the third reason is that, there's research, maybe not in this realm, but in other realms, to show that when you have this experience with someone else, we use the example of eating food, that food even tastes better when you enjoy it with someone else. So for those reasons, perhaps having a social component or sharing the experience is the third thing. And then two more things was indirect learning. So we talked about it kind of also in terms of stigma, how in the military veteran community, but also in the general public at large, that mental health stigma is a very big problem, and that having these interventions or these programs, kind of like, especially, in terms of exercise, perhaps they're disguised as something physical or disguised as something else, might help reduce stigma. And then the last thing we talked about was processing or sharing the experience that you had from these programs in an emotionally safe space.
Say that last part again, processing what?
Processing or perhaps sharing the experience in an emotionally safe space.
Mm.
We had reciprocity, purpose, socialization, community, indirect learning or stigma, disguise, and then processing.
And just one I've got.
A question that talked about elements of these interventions that we've seen work. And on the flip side, we talked about elements that perhaps we've seen not work. And maybe Sally can talk about some of those.
Thank you. And just one to add to that list of what does work, and I suppose it's a bit superficial, so I'm pleased to say there was a lot more that did work than didn't work, but one to add was youth and bringing youth and seniors together in a program, which I think is important and maybe something we haven't considered, and certainly in my practice we just have had to date in Northern Ireland sort of 1970s veterans and an older cohort, and I'm certainly going to look at that. So as I say, the list for things that didn't work was much harder to get the conversation going, but was consistent across both groups. And those were really the credibility of the program and the credibility of the instructors. So there was a piece about the values and the whole approach to outdoor, particularly if it was outward bound, and then risk management and health and safety and the ethics and how people were approaching it, whether it was in a cavalier fashion or so. Structure came into that as a way of making people feel safe, that the organisation was running a safe programme and knew what they were doing in terms of risk management, and then also cultural competency. So the instructors having a relationship and understanding military cultural competency, and how, again, this is all about building trust. And if that isn't there, it's pretty difficult to get it back or to establish it. If it's not there, almost, first impressions, if it's not there from the beginning. And there were three, I think, on your list, Nick, have I missed? And so it was about standards. It was, there was a piece that resonated, that it's helpful, standards, standardization, and I say that, and then specific health and safety and specific cultural.
We also, maybe the one that I didn't hear was we talked about the lack of structure.
Yeah, no, so I did say that, yeah, the structure, well, so yeah, structure is not the same as standardization. No, it's not the same. So yes, so structure was important, but as I say, then perhaps I put those two together, that all works towards support for a standard model, even, you know, not a completely prescriptive one, but a standard model, which supports my experience. So that was us, and it was very, very consistent. We didn't, you know, Nick did a very good job. He didn't lead the second group to say what the first group said, but they did say the same things.
That's terrific. Okay, so our question was, what's the biggest opportunity the veteran community could realize or capitalize on if it had a set of recommended practices or protocols? And we had two really different groups. So we sort of got two different tracks of conversation going. The first group among them was Kurt Engelhart, who works with the United States Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, and vets are part of his portfolio, had a very interesting insight. Reasons for coming up with protocols important for my boss who wants to advocate for these programs. Needs the evidence base would, she would want to show that it's more evident that these programs are more evidence-based, and coming up with the protocols would help with insurance, Department of Defense buy-in, and really to get, he said one of the buy-ins will have to come from Congress to get real buy-in, and having the protocols in place for that would be huge. We also had Tyler, who's a rec therapist, no experience with vets, works with neurodisabilities, said creating a sense of fidelity across spectrums. That would, keeping everyone on the same page in terms of best practices is important, but also policies need to be fluid to accommodate a wide variety of conditions. So any sort of manualized approach, I think Tyler said it would have to be a robust document that allowed for the sort of variety of conditions and people that it was treating, et cetera. We had Bryce, who said that discipline actually equals freedom, provides a baseline. Are we being effective or not? Helping to create protocols helps standardize measurable outcomes across providers. We had a nurse, Dylan, who works in an intensive care unit with transplants, and very interested in protocolization from that perspective. Had no relation to vets, but noted that protocolization is important for health benefit risks and being able to approach foundations. So again, coming back to that funding component. And Dylan was a very big fan of it, particularly from a funding perspective. But again, the sort of differences that that one would experience in both providing the services and folks that they were being provided to was brought up a lot as well. And so the second group really kind of got more into that. And what we heard from Louise was that programs that she's seen that are not directly related to vets, but they have to give choice. And she mentioned there were two organizations that sat down with teams at the beginning of a session, a season, and one of them said, you know, what are your objectives? And another was predetermined what they wanted to drive the participants toward. And the one that had more latitude built in was a simply more effective program. And we heard that a number of times, that, you know, a number of folks, Kim had actually created her own program. And her point was that creating the program brought value to her as a vet, but then also she was able to come up with something that was very effective. And she wouldn't want to not have that opportunity. And that was something that Jen with Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, who also created a program on her own with her partner, mentioned as well, that having that freedom to create these these programs and these approaches is also a very important consideration. And so there was sort of a mix of understanding that having a set of protocols that one could step into would be very important, but then also that preserving the latitude to interpret the program and to offer one's own creative input would be beneficial as well. And I think Luis, what did Luis tell me right at the end there? Needs to be flexible, and we have to be flexible in terms of the protocols and allow people to be able to interpret it for themselves as well. So those are a number of the things that that we heard, and we have just a few minutes left. And I think with our group, we can meet one more time before shift to try to process what we've heard here and move forward with it. But I'm just curious whether anyone has any sort of big picture insights or perspectives that they would like to bring to this conversation to help put a bow on it. How would we summarize what we've heard here, and how has it informed our thinking on the project? Samara, you look, you're at least smiling, so that's an opening.
Okay, so I'll, this probably isn't, super exciting, but I really appreciated meeting the other folks today, especially in my breakout. I was so thankful for the different perspectives that people shared. And I guess it's more of a little bit of an ask. I'm assuming there's a way for us to continue to share information with each other, the folks that we met at this panel. And maybe that goes through, organizations, so we don't need personal emails. But the continued ability to share, I think, is so valuable, and would just love to be able to follow up with that.
I think we can do that via our Slack channel. So
okay.
I think we can
However, the mechanism, you just tell me, we came up with a number of things that we would like to continue to converse with people about.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, that's a fantastic one. Jesse, what did you take away from this?
Interestingly, I really enjoyed the perspective of, in my world, I do evidence-based practice. This is what I do. I research practices to see if they have outcomes, right? And that's my world. And been working towards creating manualization and protocols and those kind of things. And that I think I didn't realize how much people needed it, but also maybe a little fearful of it, of that they don't want to be told what to do, right? Nobody wants to be told what to do. And so how do we get the information out there to teach them that evidence-based practice doesn't mean you lose all creativity and all flexibility, and that it is, we are going to give you a set of guidelines to follow that we know have these certain impacts, but you need to be able to fit it into what your program is. And so that piece, I don't think I realized that pushback of, I don't want to be told what to do, and making sure that we make that part of the education piece as well, of here we have this, potentially we're going to have this protocol of here manualized intervention, that but you have your own impact, flexibility, creativity that can go into it as well. And I really I don't remember who you said it, but they created their own program and from scratch, that they didn't have something to go off of. And they've got some really great things that are going on. And I'm hoping that they're measuring that. But there are a lot of programs out there that we know of that have started from scratch, and that we don't want to step on people's toes, essentially, of telling them they're doing things wrong, because I don't think you're doing things wrong. We're just trying to say, let's have better outcomes, kind of things, or here's how we know outcomes could happen. And that making sure that we're not coming across as, this is what you have to do, kind of thing, at least from my perspective.
That's what I heard too. Yeah, it's really great. Sally, what do you got?
Well, I just really like to say thank you for, we don't have any forum. I think I would know about it. I think I would know about it in the UK. We haven't had a forum that has moved on to doing the survey to give that baseline, and then is bringing together this many practitioners to start to engage their views. So I've heard things that are helping me refine what we're doing. and I'm very happy to share what we're doing to help, you know, in terms of the other way. But I just think it's sort of just, but it's definitely a journey. As we said before this, before we started today, it's a journey, but having this community now, and I think Slack would be the way to keep maturing the conversation, is invaluable. So thank you.
Nick, last thoughts?
I also want to express my thanks to everyone, and my thoughts at the end of the day are that, you know, standardization is really important for using limited resources, and in communities where it's really important to make sure you use resources efficiently, but that the standardization and the personalization can coexist together.
Okay, well, we'll use that as the jumping off point. And I can't type. Standardization and what, personalization? That's a great way to put it. Can exist together. That'll be our starting point for our conversations for Shift. And thank you all for being such a part of this. That was just phenomenal. And I was really surprised at how much it felt like Shift, you know, when we were all sitting together around those tables and brainstorming the ways to move this forward. That's really where the magic happens. And it definitely felt like we had some magic going here today. And so you've been a really key part of this effort, this program. We invite you to continue to be part of it. We'll circle back with you regarding the Slack channel. I think we'll make an individual channel specifically for this conversation. And please participate. Please bring in your perspectives, and please help us to evolve this in a way that allows you to continue to provide value to the people you're trying to serve, and creates some value for the space overall as well. So thanks to Meredith Davison, Ariane Davis. They're the ones who are working behind the scenes on this. So grateful to you for that. And thank you all for being part of it. And we hope that we will see you in 3 short weeks at Shift. So thanks so much, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.